Keith Moon, as the drummer of The Who, found a perfect outlet for his two great passions, playing the drums and wreaking havoc. Renowned as one of the greatest rock and roll drummers in history, Moon's talent was undeniable. However, his lifestyle, driven by heavy drinking and pill abuse, made him equally notorious as one of rock's greatest train wrecks. His life was a whirlwind of dangerous pranks, uncontrolled stage pyrotechnics, and broken relationships, each fueled by his chaotic energy. While he lived with unmatched fervor, his story ultimately came to a sorrowful end with a tragic and untimely death. Keith Moon was deeply infatuated with his girlfriend, Pamela Des Barres, but his obsession had a troubling side. Initially, he asked her to act as a wealthy older woman seeking a servant, indulging in a peculiar fantasy. However, this was only the beginning. Moon's fixation would soon take a far darker and more disturbing direction, which we'll explore further shortly. Keith Moon was born on August 23, 1946, and spent his childhood in the London borough of Wembley. His time at school was fraught with challenges, and he often became the target of unprofessional and harsh criticism from his teachers. One teacher went so far as to cruelly label him as bordering on disabled in art and idiotic in other aspects. Even his music teacher, instead of recognizing his potential, dismissed him as nothing more than a show-off. Despite these negative experiences, Moon was not deterred. He refused to let the limitations of traditional schooling define him, choosing instead to carve his own path, explore the world in his own way, and embrace the passions that would ultimately shape his extraordinary life. Like many children, Keith Moon enjoyed playing with chemistry sets, but his fascination was far from ordinary. He was fixated on one specific aspect of chemistry, making things explode. This destructive obsession extended beyond his experiments, as he also took great pleasure in smashing objects into tiny fragments, often turning his curiosity into a costly and chaotic hobby for his parents. At the same time, his struggles in school were a constant issue, and with his rebellious nature and inability to conform, it was no surprise when Moon eventually chose to leave his education behind entirely. As part of his larger plan, Keith Moon pursued studies in radio repair, saving up his earnings to purchase his very first drum set. To sharpen his skills, he sought instruction from Carlo Little, a drummer famed for his thunderous playing style. With his confidence growing, Moon wasted no time stepping into the spotlight and stirring up trouble. He joined his first band, the Beachcombers, and quickly devised outrageous methods to leave a lasting impression on the audience. In one unforgettable performance, he shocked the crowd by pulling out a starter pistol and pretending to shoot the lead singer, causing widespread panic. While these antics seemed playful on the surface, Moon's commitment to music ran deep. He was determined to prove his dedication and take his musical aspirations to the next level. Keith Moon tried his hand at a day job in a lumberyard, but it was clear the work couldn't channel his boundless energy. Restless and ready for a change, he caught a performance by an emerging band called The Who. At the time, the band was using a stand-in drummer, as their regular one had just been dismissed. Moon, never one to shy away from attention, showed up with striking orange-dyed hair and a fully orange outfit. An unforgettable look. Determined to make an impact, he confidently approached the group, marking the start of a life-changing moment. Keith Moon confidently approached the band, boldly claiming he could outperform the drummer they were using. Determined to back up his words, he jumped behind the drum kit for an impromptu audition. His performance was so intense that he ended up tearing the drum skin and breaking the pedal. Rather than being alarmed by his reckless style, the Who saw it as a sign of his boundless energy and enthusiasm, inviting him to join them at their next performance. What they couldn't foresee, however, was how this enigmatic drummer would go on to revolutionize the band and leave an indelible mark on their future. The Who had gained a drummer who was anything but ordinary. Keith Moon approached drumming in a way that was entirely his own. His mood dictated the tempo. If he was feeling cheerful, the beat would race ahead, but on darker days, it would slow to match his emotions. While this unique style allowed Moon to pour his personality into his music, it made keeping up with him a tricky task for the rest of the band. It was evident that Moon brought something entirely unconventional to the role of a drummer. Keith Moon stood out among drummers for one particularly unusual quirk: his disdain for drum solos, a staple that most drummers embraced. By 1974, his aversion had become well known, prompting The Who to play a cheeky prank during a performance at Madison Square Garden. Mid-song, Pete Townshend and John Entwistle suddenly stopped playing, leaving Moon to take over. Realizing their intent, he refused to oblige, shouting, "Drum solos are boring," and declining to continue. This moment not only highlighted his unique perspective, but also showcased his unapologetic confidence and willingness to break convention, even in front of a massive audience. During one live performance, Pete Townshend accidentally broke his guitar. Realizing it was no longer usable, he decided to smash it dramatically on stage. The crowd erupted with excitement at this unexpected display of destruction, and Keith Moon couldn't resist joining in. For the audience's amusement, he furiously kicked over his drum kit. What started as a spur-of-the-moment reaction quickly turned into a signature move for Moon, albeit a habit that proved both costly and chaotic. Keith Moon had another infamous habit: his use of illicit substances. In an interview with NME, he jokingly referred to French blues as his favorite food. This wasn't a culinary dish, but rather Dexamyl, a popular amphetamine used by housewives, mods, and even a British prime minister for different purposes. Moon's reliance on pills didn't stop there. He often combined them with heavy drinking, a dangerous mix that fueled much of his outrageous and unpredictable behavior. Keith Moon's first experience with trashing a hotel room took place while The Who were performing in Berlin. Although such antics were common among rock stars, Moon's approach was anything but ordinary. Drawing inspiration from his childhood experiments with chemistry sets, he packed explosives into the toilet and eagerly watched as chaos unfolded. The resulting destruction reportedly cost up to $500,000 in repairs. While many of Moon's destructive episodes appeared impulsive, others seemed disturbingly calculated and deliberate. During one trip to the airport, Keith Moon abruptly declared that they had to turn back to the hotel because he had forgotten something important. The band reluctantly complied, assuming he'd left behind a personal item. However, when they got to the room, it became clear that Moon hadn't forgotten anything at all. He had simply neglected to toss the television into the swimming pool, a ritual he apparently felt was essential. Satisfied after completing his task, Moon rejoined the band, and they continued on their way to the airport as though nothing unusual had happened. Keith Moon was testing the limits of his bandmates' patience, and tensions were about to boil over. In 1966, Moon had the chance to spend time with one of his idols, Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys. The two hit it off so well that Moon lost track of time and completely forgot about The Who's concert that evening. When he finally showed up, the band was already performing. He rushed onto the stage, but Pete Townshend, furious at the delay, didn't care about the thousands of fans watching. In a fit of rage, he struck Moon with his guitar. However, the story didn't end there. Moon soon began plotting his revenge. Keith Moon reached a breaking point with Pete Townshend and declared he was leaving The Who. To make matters more dramatic, he announced that John Entwistle was coming with him, effectively splitting the band in half. It seemed like the end of an era for The Who. However, Moon soon realized the magnitude of what he was walking away from and quietly returned to the band. Naturally, this reunion didn't mean Moon had any intention of toning down his antics. His unpredictable behavior was as much a part of The Who as his drumming. That same year, The Who made an appearance on the U.S. variety show, The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Hosts Tom and Dick Smothers, known for their edgy humor and rebellious streak, were eager to capitalize on Keith Moon's chaotic and explosive energy. They expected a memorable performance, hoping for a bit of excitement to spice up the show. What they ended up with, however, went far beyond anything they had imagined or prepared for. Keith Moon was eager to pull off his signature exploding drum kit prank, but decided that for U.S. television, it had to be bigger and more dramatic, a true go big or go home moment. Although there were strict rules about such stunts, Moon reportedly bribed a stagehand to amplify the explosion to 10 times the permitted size. When the band finished their second song, chaos ensued. Pete Townshend smashed his guitar and Moon set off the massive blast from his drums, creating absolute pandemonium on stage and solidifying his reputation for outrageous antics. The studio audience was stunned when a blinding flash of light was followed by a thunderous tremor that shook the room, filling the studio with thick smoke. The cameras captured Pete Townshend, grimacing in pain, his fingers pressed tightly against his ears. As the chaos unfolded, Tommy Smothers walked onto the stage holding an acoustic guitar, only for Townshend to grab it and smash it to pieces. This wild spectacle was far from the usual fare for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and left the show dealing with significant repercussions. Keith Moon stood closest to the explosion, and shrapnel from a cymbal even lodged in his arm. However, Pete Townshend bore the brunt of the chaos. He later recounted how his hair caught fire and how the blast caused him permanent hearing damage. Unfortunately, this wasn't the last time Moon's penchant for destruction would harm someone close to him, leaving a lasting mark on his friendships and bandmates. Keith Moon's behavior was spiraling, but in one aspect of his life he was about to find some stability. In early 1965, he began a relationship with model Kim Kerrigan. By the end of that year, Kerrigan was pregnant, and the couple married in July 1966. Shortly after, they welcomed a daughter, Amanda. However, Moon kept his marriage and family life a secret from the press for years, only publicly acknowledging it in 1968. Despite his secretive nature, Keith Moon was intensely jealous as a husband. His wife, a model, often became the target of his possessiveness. If another man so much as commented on her appearance, Moon would cruelly direct his anger at her. He also pressured her to abandon her modeling career entirely, a demand that seemed especially hypocritical, given that Moon himself was pursuing a modeling career at the same time. This contradiction highlighted the complexity and often the volatility of Moon's behavior in his personal relationships. Keith Moon's jealousy eventually crossed a terrifying line. Kim Kerrigan often lived in fear of his unpredictable and violent behavior. On one occasion, his anger escalated so severely that she had to barricade herself in the bathroom to escape him. Refusing to back down, Moon grabbed a kitchen knife and attempted to cut through the door to reach her. This chilling incident made it clear that Kerrigan's safety was at constant risk around Moon. Unfortunately, his volatility extended beyond his personal life. His fellow bandmates weren't safe from his outbursts either. While touring with Peter Frampton, Keith Moon couldn't resist causing trouble. Peering out of the dressing room window, he began teasing fans gathered on the street below. Then, in typical Moon fashion, he persuaded Frampton to join him at the window. Before Frampton realized what was happening, Moon and bandmate John Entwistle had grabbed him, holding him upside down by his legs and dangling him out the window. Moon's increasingly reckless behavior was building toward something more dramatic, which ultimately came to a head during a tour stop in Flint, Michigan in 1967. While on tour with Herman's Hermits, The Who arrived in Flint, Michigan just in time to celebrate Keith Moon's 20th birthday. Knowing that the legal drinking age in the United States was 21, Moon lied and claimed he was turning 21 instead of 20. Unsurprisingly, no one checked his ID before serving him alcohol. What followed became one of the most infamous moments in rock and roll history. Upon arriving in Michigan, Keith Moon began drinking heavily, and by the time The Who took the stage, he was already thoroughly intoxicated. Despite his condition, he managed to get through the performance. Afterward, the band returned to the Holiday Inn, where they were greeted with 200 birthday cakes sent by enthusiastic fans. Skeptical of eating cakes from unknown sources, the band members avoided tasting them, but Moon had a different idea. Without hesitation, he grabbed a piece and launched it, sparking a massive food fight that everyone eagerly joined in, ensuring the cakes didn't go entirely to waste. When police arrived at the hotel, they were met with a face full of cake, courtesy of Keith Moon, who by this point was wearing nothing but his underwear. As his bandmates tried to help him evade the authorities, they hurriedly rushed him out of the hotel. In the chaos, Moon took a tumble, knocking out a tooth. This led to a trip to the hospital, where the situation quickly became another classic Moon escapade. The doctors determined they needed to extract what remained of the tooth, but there was a significant complication. Moon was far too intoxicated for them to safely administer anesthesia. As the story goes, the doctors went ahead and removed Keith Moon's tooth, but instead of taking it as a cue to rest, he was only getting warmed up. Back at the Holiday Inn, Moon unleashed his signature chaos. Joined by some of his bandmates, he began tossing furniture, and reportedly even a few guests, into the swimming pool. Fire extinguishers were emptied for good measure, adding to the pandemonium. The destruction hit a crescendo when they turned their attention to a piano, tearing it apart. Before they could do any further damage, the police arrived, finally putting an end to the mayhem. Keith Moon faced serious consequences for the chaos he caused. The Holiday Inn charged the band an enormous $24,000 to cover the damage and declared that The Who would never be allowed to stay at one of their Michigan locations again. Among the wild stories that circulated was a claim that Moon had driven a car into the hotel pool. While Roger Daltrey admitted he didn't personally see the car, he did confirm the substantial cost of removing and repairing one, adding a layer of mystery to the already legendary incident. Keith Moon's reckless behavior would soon take a tragic turn. In January 1970, while at a pub in the UK, he noticed a group of customers outside vandalizing his beloved Bentley. Despite being heavily intoxicated, Moon got into the driver's seat, determined to protect his car. In the ensuing chaos, he accidentally hit his bodyguard, driver, and close friend, Neil Boland. The outcome was devastating. Boland was fatally injured in the incident. Although Moon was not held legally accountable for the crash, the tragedy left a deep emotional scar, haunting him for the rest of his life. Keith Moon's troubles were far from over, and his life was about to take another downward turn. Despite his wild behavior, Moon genuinely loved his time playing with The Who. So when the band decided to take a 1.5-year hiatus in 1971, he found himself adrift, unsure of how to fill the void. His solution? Adding cocktails to his breakfast routine. With no drumming or physical activity to keep him occupied, Moon's lifestyle became increasingly sedentary, and his health began to deteriorate as a result. When The Who returned to the stage, Keith Moon was eager to dive back into performing, showing the same enthusiasm and energy fans had come to expect. However, during the 1973 U.S. tour for Quadrophenia, his overindulgence caught up with him in a dramatic way. Before one particular concert, Moon had taken tranquilizers, and as if that weren't risky enough, washed them down with several shots of alcohol. This reckless combination turned disastrous mid-performance. As the band played on, Moon suddenly stopped drumming, the rhythm collapsing into silence. Confused, the other members turned to see what had happened and were met with a shocking sight. Moon, completely unconscious, slumped over his drums. The once unstoppable force of chaos and rhythm had been abruptly halted by his own destructive habits. The incident not only disrupted the show but also became a glaring reminder of how far Moon's lifestyle was spiraling out of control. Despite his incredible talent and passion for music, moments like this cast a shadow over his otherwise legendary performances. The situation couldn't have been more intense. The Who were performing in front of a massive, electrified crowd in an arena, but there was one glaring problem. Their drummer, Keith Moon, was out of commission. After Moon had collapsed mid-performance, the roadies quickly carried him off stage. Under normal circumstances, he would have been taken to see a doctor immediately, but that didn't happen. Instead, someone made the questionable decision to try reviving him with a cold shower and a shot of cortisone, hoping it would be enough to get him back on his feet. When Moon finally regained consciousness, his first instinct was to return to the stage. Despite his condition, he was determined to continue the show. The crew reluctantly agreed, propping him back behind his drum kit, clinging to the hope that he could pull through for the rest of the performance. But their hopes were quickly dashed. Barely able to keep himself upright, Moon once again lost consciousness and collapsed behind his drums, leaving the band in an even more precarious position than before. It was a dramatic and chaotic moment, one that underscored both Moon's dedication to his craft and the toll his lifestyle was taking on his health. After Keith Moon passed out, the roadies quickly carried him backstage, leaving the rest of The Who to attempt continuing the concert without their drummer. They tried to push through a few songs, but it quickly became obvious they couldn't go on without a proper rhythm section. In a moment of desperation, Pete Townshend did something completely unexpected. He turned to the audience and asked if there were any drummers willing to step in. To everyone's surprise, a nervous and inexperienced fan volunteered, taking Moon's place for the rest of the show. Though far from a professional, this brave audience member managed to keep the performance from falling apart entirely, saving the night in the process. However, the incident underscored a harsh reality. Moon's unpredictable and self-destructive behavior was no longer just a personal problem. It was starting to take a toll on the band's reputation, raising concerns about how long they could sustain their success with Moon at the helm of the drum kit. A few years later, The Who were performing at Boston Garden when yet another of Keith Moon's infamous incidents unfolded. Just 2 songs into the show, Moon passed out on stage, forcing the band to cancel the concert entirely. Despite the setback, Moon's energy somehow returned the following evening, but not in the way anyone might have hoped. He indulged in his usual destructive antics, leaving his hotel room in shambles. When the band's manager, Bill Curbishley, came to check on him, he found Moon lying unconscious amidst the chaos. At first, this didn't seem unusual for Moon, whose wild behavior often ended this way. However, Curbishley soon realized something was seriously wrong. Moon was bleeding heavily. Alarmed, Curbishley rushed him to the hospital, where doctors quickly stitched him up. For most people, this would have been a sobering experience, but for Moon, It was just another episode in his tumultuous life. Curbishly, the Who's manager, later confessed that he had let his frustration get the better of him while dealing with an unconscious Keith Moon. Furious over yet another instance of Moon's destructive behavior, he admitted to angrily telling Moon that he'd call a doctor to revive him, just so he could break Moon's jaw afterward. Despite his anger, the doctor's intervention, prompted by Curbishly, ultimately saved Moon's life. By this point, Moon's erratic and self-destructive behavior had pushed his bandmates to their limits. The other members of the Who were growing increasingly weary of the constant chaos he brought to their lives, both on and off the stage. His antics, once tolerated or even laughed off, had become a source of deep frustration, threatening not just their patience, but the stability of the band itself. In 1974, the Who embarked on creating a film adaptation of their iconic album, Tommy. Among the cast was renowned actor Oliver Reed, whose larger-than-life reputation as a party enthusiast even outshone Keith Moon's legendary antics. Naturally, Moon was eager to meet Reed, sensing a kindred spirit in chaos. However, Moon wasn't content with an ordinary introduction. He wanted to make an impression that Reed would never forget. True to form, Moon decided to go completely over the top, orchestrating an entrance as outrageous as his personality. Oliver Reed, the breakout star of 1968's Oliver, was relaxing in his bath when the sudden roar of a helicopter interrupted his peace. Startled and apparently ready for anything, Reed grabbed an antique sword, dashed to the roof in nothing but a towel, and began wildly swinging the blade at the intruder above. As the helicopter descended, Reed realized it wasn't a threat. It was Keith Moon making a typically grand entrance. Once he recognized Moon, Reed abandoned his impromptu defense, put the sword aside, and instead grabbed 2 drinks. This unexpected and absurd encounter marked the beginning of a legendary and tumultuous friendship between 2 of the most infamous hellraisers of their time. It quickly became obvious that Keith Moon and Oliver Reed were a dangerous combination. During the filming of Tommy, the 2 infamous party boys fueled each other's chaotic tendencies. Moon roped Reed into his trademark antics, including hurling TVs out of hotel windows, a pastime Reed was more than happy to join. Their mischief didn't stop there. While in Los Angeles, the pair kidnapped filmmaker David Putnam and subjected him to an impromptu and entirely unwelcome joyride along the Pacific Coast Highway. In yet another outrageous incident, Reed dared Moon to remove his pants in the middle of a Hollywood restaurant so everyone could witness that he was uncircumcised. This shameless behavior, rather than causing a rift, solidified their bond, turning them into inseparable partners in mischief. Keith Moon and Oliver Reed's eccentric friendship took an even stranger turn with the addition of an unusual third companion, a tortoise. During their infamous drinking parties, the tortoise wasn't just a bystander, it served a peculiar purpose. The 2 men used their slow-moving friend to ferry drinks back and forth, attempting to pace themselves by literally slowing down their drinking. But that wasn't the tortoise's only role. On occasion, Moon and Reed would strip down and dash naked through the halls, using the tortoise as a makeshift cover for their private parts. Unsurprisingly, these impromptu streaking escapades were anything but speedy, thanks to their unconventional choice of modesty. Their antics were yet another bizarre chapter in their wild and often surreal friendship. It looked like Keith Moon and Oliver Reed would remain boozy partners in crime forever, but eventually, one of them realized a change was needed. When the Who relocated to California, Moon joined them, but his move had a deeper purpose. Some believe Moon hoped the change of scenery would help him tackle his drinking problem, something nearly impossible with Reed constantly by his side. The farewell was bittersweet, marking the end of their wild adventures together. As a parting gesture, Moon left Reed two memorable tokens: a massive fiberglass rhinoceros and his beloved dog, Beanbag. Moon entrusted Reed with the responsibility of caring for both, leaving behind not just gifts, but a symbol of their unruly yet unforgettable friendship. Although Keith Moon and Oliver Reed eventually went their separate ways, Moon found a way to keep their friendship alive in his own outrageous style. In 1975, Reed was attending a film premiere, walking down the red carpet with all the glamour expected of the occasion, when a stranger suddenly shoved a pie into his face. As Reed stood there, stunned and covered in cream, the prankster handed him a card. The message revealed the true mastermind behind the stunt. The card read that Reed had been officially inducted into Pie in the Face International, courtesy of none other than Keith Moon. True to form, Moon had found a way to remind his friend of their wild bond in the most unexpected and thoroughly embarrassing fashion. Although Keith Moon had distanced himself from Oliver Reed in an attempt to get sober, he quickly found new partners in mischief. One legendary tale involves Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, who was staying at the Navarro Hotel in New York City. Relaxing and watching TV in his room on the 42nd floor, Garcia suddenly heard an unsettling tap, tap, tap on his window. Curious and more than a little alarmed, Garcia pulled back the curtains to investigate. To his utter disbelief, there was Moon clinging precariously to the window ledge, grinning and pleading to be let inside. It was another outrageous and death-defying stunt from the man who seemed to thrive on pushing boundaries, both social and physical. Keith Moon, in typical fashion, found himself in a bizarre predicament. While staying at a hotel, he had accidentally locked himself inside his own haze of confusion. He simply forgot how to unbolt his room door. Instead of solving the problem the usual way, Moon opted for a more dramatic approach. He climbed out onto the ledge of the building and carefully shimmied over to the neighboring room, which happened to belong to Jerry Garcia. Garcia, ever the good sport, let Moon in, and the two decided to make the best of the situation by heading out for a night on the town. But Moon, still needing to return to his own room, soon found himself facing the same problem. The door was still bolted from the inside. Determined to solve the issue his way, Moon was ready to go to extreme lengths to get back inside, turning a simple inconvenience into yet another one of his wild escapades. Once Keith Moon was safely inside Jerry Garcia's room, he set to work solving his predicament in true Moon fashion. Garcia discovered him in the closet, frantically using his mouth and hands to chew and claw his way through the wall into the adjoining room. When this method proved ineffective, Moon upgraded his tools, grabbing a hammer and chisel to make faster progress. His desperation had a predictable cause. Moon's stash was locked in his own room, and he was determined to retrieve it by any means necessary. Astonishingly, his persistence paid off, and he succeeded in creating a hole large enough to crawl through. Despite the destruction, Moon faced only minor consequences from hotel staff. After all, the Who owned a third of the Navarro Hotel, giving Moon just enough leeway to turn his chaotic antics into yet another infamous story. Later that same night, Keith Moon managed to smuggle an enormous tank of nitrous oxide, commonly known as laughing gas, into the hotel, as if his earlier antics hadn't been wild enough. But the humor stopped there, as the reality of his situation was far from a joke. Moon's personal life had been unraveling. His marriage came to a bitter end in 1975, and soon after, he began a relationship with another model, Annette Walter Lax. Annette cared deeply for Moon, but only when he was sober, a rarity in his chaotic lifestyle. Desperate to save him from his self-destructive habits, she turned to doctors for help. Their response was grim. Moon's notorious breakfast of champagne and amphetamines, along with years of heavy abuse, had left his body in such a dire state that they considered him beyond saving. Despite her love and efforts, Moon's downward spiral seemed unstoppable as his reckless lifestyle continued to take its toll. Keith Moon decided it was time to regain control of his life, but his approach was as unconventional as ever. In 1978, he rented the very apartment where Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas had tragically passed away. His goal was to finally quit drinking, and to achieve this he enlisted the help of Dr. Jeffrey Diamond, who prescribed him heminevrin, a sedative meant to ease withdrawal symptoms. However, in what turned out to be a catastrophic misstep, Diamond handed Moon 100 pills along with strict instructions to take no more than 3 per day. Given Moon's history of excess and disregard for limits, this decision would prove to be both ill-advised and dangerously naive, setting the stage for another tragic chapter in Moon's tumultuous life. In September 1978, after dining with Paul and Linda McCartney, Keith Moon returned home with his girlfriend, Annette Walter Lax. At some point that night, he became irritated and swore at her when she refused to cook him lamb cutlets. Tragically, those harsh words would be the last he ever spoke. Later that evening, Walter Lax discovered Moon's lifeless body and immediately called for help. The coroner's report revealed a grim reality. Moon had ingested 6 heminevrin pills, a sedative prescribed to help him manage his alcohol withdrawal. These alone were enough to be fatal, but an additional 26 undigested pills were also found in his system, underscoring the recklessness that marked his final moments. At just 32 years old, Moon's life came to an untimely end, robbing the world of a legendary talent. Though his time was short, his influence on music and his larger-than-life persona ensured that his legacy would endure far beyond his years. After Keith Moon's passing, The Who struggled to find a drummer who could truly fill his shoes. Several musicians stepped in, but none managed to capture the unique energy and chemistry Moon had brought to the band. Eventually, they found their ideal replacement in an unexpected place, Zach Starkey, the son of Beatles drummer Ringo Starr. The connection was more profound than anyone could have imagined. Starkey had grown up knowing Moon as Uncle Keith, and it was Moon himself who had gifted Starkey his very first drum kit, sparking his passion for drumming. In many ways, Starkey's addition to the band felt like a full-circle moment in the world of rock and roll, a fitting continuation of Moon's legacy. Famous groupie Pamela Des Barres, known for her flings with rock's elite, shared details in her memoirs about her steamy and unconventional romance with Keith Moon. According to Des Barres, Moon's wild and eccentric personality extended to his private life as well. One of his more peculiar requests involved role-playing. He wanted her to pretend to be a wealthy older woman seeking a steward, a scenario as bizarre as it was revealing of his eccentric nature. However, beneath the playful oddities, Moon was harboring an even darker secret, one that reflected the complex and troubled layers of his personality, hinting at the turmoil that often lay beneath his wild exterior. Keith Moon's relationship with Pamela Des Barres wasn't solely defined by wild escapades and frivolity. During their time together, Moon confided in her about the deepest pain he carried, the tragic death of his bodyguard and close friend, Neil Boland. Although Moon had been officially cleared of any legal responsibility for the accident, the circumstances haunted him. At the time, Moon had been under the influence of drugs, and while he wasn't directly at fault, he couldn't shake the overwhelming guilt. This lingering remorse was a rare glimpse into the emotional weight Moon bore behind his often chaotic and carefree exterior. And that wraps up the whirlwind journey through the wild and unforgettable life of Keith Moon. If these stories brought a smile to your face or left you in awe of his larger-than-life antics, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. There's plenty more where this came from, so stay tuned for more incredible tales coming your way. Thanks for spending your time with us today, and we'll see you again soon. Until next time.